There is a place in the western Pacific Ocean where the seafloor drops away from the rest of the planet in a manner so extreme that the numbers required to describe it lose their meaning before you finish reading them. The Mariana Trench extends for approximately 2,500 kilometers in a crescent shape east of the Mariana Islands, and at its deepest confirmed point, a location called Challenger Deep, the ocean floor sits nearly 11 kilometers below the surface. To put that in terms the human mind can actually process, if you took Mount Everest and placed it at the bottom of Challenger Deep, its summit would still be buried under more than 2 kilometers of water. The pressure at that depth is approximately 1,000 times greater than the pressure at sea level. The temperature hovers just above freezing. No sunlight has ever reached it. No photosynthesis occurs there. Whatever lives in that darkness lives on whatever falls from above. The slow rain of dead organic matter that oceanographers call marine snow, drifting down through 11 kilometers of black water to feed ecosystems that operate by rules we are still in the early stages of understanding. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about the Mariana Trench. That statement has become a cliché of popular science communication, repeated so often that it has lost some of its capacity to shock. But sit with it for a moment as a literal claim about the state of human knowledge. We have sent rovers to Mars. We have mapped its surface in extraordinary detail. We have analyzed the composition of its soil and its atmosphere, and we have photographs of its landscape so detailed that you can see individual pebbles. The Mariana Trench, which exists on our own planet, in the ocean that covers 70% of the Earth's surface and that we have been sailing across for thousands of years, remains substantially unmapped, substantially unexplored, and substantially unknown. The total time human beings have spent at the deepest point of the Mariana Trench, across all the expeditions ever conducted, amounts to a few hours. That is not a rounding error. That is the full extent of direct human observation at the deepest place on Earth. The question of why we stopped exploring it is more complicated than it first appears, because the honest answer is that we never really started. The history of deep ocean exploration is a history of extraordinary technical achievement followed by long stretches of institutional indifference, of missions that reached the bottom and then were not followed up, of discoveries so strange and so far outside existing frameworks of biological and geological understanding that the scientific community required decades to begin incorporating them. The Mariana Trench has not been abandoned because we decided there was nothing interesting there. It has been inadequately explored because the combination of technical difficulty, institutional funding constraints, and the sheer scale of the challenge has consistently made other scientific priorities seem more tractable and more rewarding to the agencies and governments that allocate resources. The first serious human engagement with the Mariana Trench came in 1951 when the British survey vessel HMS Challenger 2 used echo sounding equipment to measure the depth of the area that now bears its name, Challenger Deep. The measurement suggested a depth of approximately 10,800 meters, a figure that revised slightly upward with subsequent and more sophisticated measurement. The discovery that the ocean floor went this deep was significant enough, but the technology of 1951 offered no way to actually reach or investigate what was down there. That would require a vessel capable of surviving pressure conditions that exceed the structural limits of almost every material and engineering approach available at the time. The mission that actually put human beings at the bottom of Challenger Deep happened in January of 1960, when Jacques Picard and Don Walsh descended in a vessel called the Trieste, a bathyscaphe developed by Picard's father Auguste. The Trieste was not elegant. It was essentially a steel sphere, designed to resist crushing pressure, suspended beneath a large float filled with aviation gasoline for buoyancy. It had no propulsion system capable of meaningful horizontal movement. It went straight down and straight up, a controlled fall and a controlled rise, with the two men inside sitting in the pressure sphere and looking out through a small porthole into the darkness. The descent took nearly 5 hours. They reached the bottom and spent approximately 20 minutes there before ascending, a journey that took another 3 hours. During those 20 minutes at the bottom, Walsh and Picard observed through their porthole what appeared to be flatfish resting on the sediment, an observation that was immediately controversial because established biological thinking at the time suggested that vertebrate life at that depth was essentially impossible given the pressure conditions. That observation has never been definitively resolved. Later expeditions using remotely operated vehicles have documented organisms at extreme depths that challenge existing understanding of what biology can tolerate, but the specific question of whether the creatures Walsh and P. Carr saw were fish or some other organism remains open. What is not open is the significance of what they demonstrated. Human beings could reach the deepest point on Earth. The technology to do it, however primitive, existed. The question that followed was what would be done with that demonstration, and the answer, which is the core of the puzzle the subject presents, is essentially nothing for more than 50 years. The next time a human being descended to Challenger Deep was in 2012, when filmmaker and explorer James Cameron made a solo descent in a specially designed submersible called the Deep Sea Challenger. The gap between 1960 and 2012 represents 52 years during which the most extreme environment on our own planet went without a single direct human visit. In that same period, humanity sent 12 people to the moon, launched spacecraft that have now left the solar system entirely, built a permanent orbiting space station, and mapped the cosmic microwave background radiation left over from the Big Bang. The contrast between what we invested in looking outward and what we invested in looking at the deepest point of our own planet is not a minor discrepancy. It is a statement about institutional priorities that the ocean sciences community has been making with increasing frustration for decades. The reasons for this discrepancy are multiple and interconnected. Deep ocean exploration is extraordinarily expensive. A single mission to Challenger Deep using a crewed submersible represents an investment that competes directly with satellite missions, particle physics experiments, and space exploration programs, all of which have better organized advocacy communities and more dramatic public appeal. The Mariana Trench does not photograph well. Images of the deep ocean are dark, often featureless to the untrained eye, and difficult to present to a general audience in a way that generates the kind of sustained public enthusiasm that drives funding. Space exploration has always benefited from imagery of extraordinary beauty, from the pale blue dot photograph to the Hubble Deep Field to the first images from the James Webb Space Telescope. The deep ocean offers no equivalent aesthetic. Its wonders are biological and geological and chemical, not visual, and they require context and expertise to appreciate that the general public cannot be expected to bring spontaneously. There is also a technical challenge that does not have a clean solution. The pressure at Challenger Deep is approximately 1,100 times standard atmospheric pressure. Every material used in the construction of a vessel intended to reach that depth must be engineered to survive those conditions without failing, and failure at that depth is not a recoverable situation. The engineering tolerances required are extreme, the testing protocols are demanding, and the margin for error is effectively zero. This is not a problem that can be solved incrementally by making small improvements to existing technology. It requires purpose-built systems that have no other application, which means that the economic case for developing them is difficult to make outside of a context of sustained institutional commitment to deep ocean research. What makes the relative absence of exploration particularly striking is what the limited exploration that has occurred has found. The Mariana Trench is not an empty geological feature. It is an ecosystem of extraordinary complexity and strangeness, operating under conditions that challenge fundamental assumptions about what life requires. The organisms that inhabit the deepest reaches of the trench have evolved adaptations to pressure, cold, and darkness that represent some of the most extreme biological engineering on the planet. Amphipods, small crustaceans related to shrimp, have been recovered from depths approaching the bottom of Challenger Deep and have been found to contain compounds in their cell membranes specifically adapted to maintain flexibility at pressures that would solidify the lipid membranes of surface-dwelling organisms. Sea cucumbers, polychaete worms, and foraminifera have been documented at extreme depths, along with microbial communities that derive energy from chemical reactions rather than from sunlight, representing ecosystems that are entirely independent of the photosynthetic base that supports virtually all life at the surface. The geological significance of the Mariana Trench is equally profound and equally underexplored. The trench exists because the Pacific Plate is being subducted beneath the Mariana Plate in one of the most active tectonic processes on the planet. The subduction zone that produced the trench is also responsible for the chain of volcanic islands that defines the western boundary of the region, and understanding the dynamics of that subduction process is directly relevant to understanding seismic and volcanic hazard across the Western Pacific. The sediment at the bottom of the trench contains a geological archive stretching back tens of millions of years, recording the chemical composition of the ancient ocean, the history of biological productivity at the surface, and the record of geological events across an enormous span of time. That archive has barely been sampled. The question of contamination adds another dimension of urgency to the exploration question. Human activity has reached the bottom of the Mariana Trench before comprehensive scientific exploration has. Expeditions using landers and remotely operated vehicles have discovered plastic debris at the bottom of Challenger Deep, along with elevated concentrations of persistent organic pollutants including polychlorinated biphenyls and polybrominated diphenyl ethers, industrial chemicals that were produced primarily in the 20th century and that have no natural source in the deep ocean. The presence of these compounds at the deepest point on Earth demonstrates that the biological and chemical systems of the trench are not isolated from the consequences of surface human activity, and it raises questions about the impact of contamination on an ecosystem we have not yet characterized well enough to understand what disruption means. The discovery of these pollutants at extreme depth is itself a subject of active research, because the mechanism by which they reached the bottom is not entirely understood. One hypothesis involves the consumption of contaminated food sources by organisms that then die and sink, concentrating pollutants through the biological process as material moves down through the water column. Another involves the adhesion of pollutants to the organic particles that constitute marine snow, carrying them down through 11 kilometers of water over timescales that may span years or decades. Understanding which mechanisms are operating and at what rates requires sustained monitoring of deep ocean chemistry that has not been conducted at the scale the question demands. The technological development that has done the most to expand knowledge of the deep ocean without addressing the fundamental gap in direct exploration is the remotely operated vehicle. ROVs equipped with lights, cameras, manipulator arms, and sampling equipment can be deployed from surface vessels and controlled via fiber optic tethers to conduct observations and collections at depths that no human crew could survive. The vehicles that have visited the Mariana Trench using this technology have returned imagery and samples that have transformed understanding of deep ocean biology and geology. They have documented hydrothermal activity, observed behaviors of deep-sea organisms that were entirely unknown before their deployment, and recovered geological samples that have informed understanding of subduction zone dynamics. But they are limited by the length and management challenges of their tethers, by the communication delays introduced by the distances involved, and by the fundamental constraint that a remotely operated vehicle can only go where its operators direct it, which means that it can only investigate what its operators already know to look for. Autonomous underwater vehicles represent the next generation of deep ocean exploration technology, and they address some of the limitations of remotely operated systems. An AUV can be programmed to follow a predetermined survey pattern, covering areas of the seafloor systematically without requiring real-time human direction, and it can operate without a tether, giving it freedom of movement that tethered systems cannot match. Several AUV missions have contributed significantly to mapping and characterization of the Mariana Trench and surrounding areas. But autonomous systems of the current generation have limited endurance, limited sample collection capability, and decision-making algorithms that cannot respond to unexpected observations with the flexibility that a human observer or even a skilled remotely operated vehicle pilot can bring to an unfamiliar environment. The sounds that emanate from the deep ocean represent another dimension of the trench's strangeness that has received significant scientific attention. The deep sound channel, a layer of the ocean at intermediate depth where the speed of sound reaches a minimum and acoustic energy becomes trapped, allows sounds to propagate across enormous distances with very little loss. This acoustic layer has been used for submarine detection and communication since the Second World War, and it has also served as a medium through which biological sounds from the deep ocean travel to hydrophone arrays maintained for other purposes. Recordings made through these systems have documented acoustic events that do not correspond to any identified natural source, events that have generated both scientific papers and popular speculation. The scientific consensus is that most or all of these events have natural explanations involving geological processes, marine mammal vocalizations, or physical oceanographic phenomena. But the consensus also acknowledges that our catalog of deep ocean acoustic sources is incomplete, which means that the possibility of unidentified biological contributors cannot be definitively excluded by current knowledge. The biological discoveries that deep ocean exploration has produced represent a consistent pattern of encountering life where established theories suggested it should not exist and finding forms and functions that no prior framework predicted. The hydrothermal vent communities discovered in 1977 along the Galapagos Rift were the first demonstration that complete ecosystems could operate independently of sunlight, powered entirely by chemical energy derived from geological processes. Before that discovery, no serious scientist had proposed that this was possible. The discovery required a fundamental revision of understanding about the requirements for life and expanded dramatically the range of environments in which life might theoretically exist, including the subsurface oceans of icy moons in the outer solar system. The implication is direct and important. Every time we have made a serious effort to look at the deep ocean, we have found things that were not supposed to be there. The reasonable inference from this pattern is that sustained serious exploration of the Mariana Trench and the deep ocean more generally would continue to produce discoveries that revise foundational understanding in ways we cannot currently anticipate. The most recent phase of renewed interest in deep ocean exploration has been driven partly by private investment and partly by the recognition within the scientific community that the period of treating the deep ocean as essentially irrelevant to pressing questions about the planet's future is ending. Ocean warming, acidification, deoxygenation, and the disruption of deep circulation patterns are all processes that will have profound consequences for human societies and for the biosphere, and all of them are occurring in water columns and at depths that remain substantially unmonitored and poorly understood. The practical argument for deep ocean exploration, which has always existed alongside the pure scientific argument, is becoming more urgent as the realization spreads that the systems we are altering are systems we do not understand well enough to model or predict. The Mariana Trench specifically contains within its sediments and its water column information about the history of the ocean system that cannot be recovered from any other source. The record of deep water chemistry across geological time, the archive of biological productivity and ocean circulation preserved in sediment layers, the documentation of past climate states that the deep ocean uniquely preserves, all of these represent datasets that are directly relevant to understanding the trajectory of the climate system and the future of the ocean as a habitat. Accessing that archive requires exactly the sustained, systematic, technically sophisticated exploration program that has never been mounted. What sits at the bottom of the Mariana Trench is not a mystery in the romantic sense that popular treatment of the subject tends to emphasize. It is not a mystery of sea monsters or lost civilizations or unexplained phenomena that science refuses to investigate. It is a mystery in the most straightforward and consequential scientific sense, which is that we do not know what is there because we have not looked carefully enough for long enough with the right instruments. The organisms that inhabit those depths are real animals following evolutionary rules that are comprehensible and that would become understood with sufficient study. The geological processes operating at the subduction zone are real physical phenomena that follow the same laws of physics that operate everywhere else. The chemical and biological archive preserved in the trench sediments is a real historical record waiting to be read. What we have consistently failed to provide is the sustained commitment of resources and institutional attention that reading that record requires. The gap between what the Mariana Trench could tell us about the planet we live on and what we have actually learned from it is not a technical gap. The technology to close it either exists or is within reach of existing engineering capability. It is a gap of priority, of will, of the collective decision about what questions matter enough to invest in answering seriously and systematically over the time required to produce real understanding. The trench will still be there. The pressure at Challenger Deep will remain what it is regardless of whether we send vehicles to measure it. The organisms at the bottom will continue to live and die and evolve in the darkness without waiting for human observers to document them. What changes if we look and what changes if we do not is not the trench. It is us. It is the depth and accuracy of our understanding of the planet we depend on, and the adequacy of that understanding to the decisions we are being forced to make about its future. That is the reason to go back. Not because something strange is waiting at the bottom, though strange things certainly are. Because the information we need to understand where we are going is sitting 11 kilometers below the surface of an ocean we have barely begun to explore, and it will not wait indefinitely for us to decide we are ready to look at it honestly.